How do you determine progression in the weight room? As coaches, there's multiple ways that we go about knowing if an athlete is progressing or not. And in this video, I'm going to go over the pillars of progression. It's more than load. There's more to progression than just progressive overload. There's always progressive overload in the weight room. At least there should be at some form. But what is the types of progressions that we want to see in an athlete? Progressive overload is a gradual increase in weight, frequency, or number of repetitions in the strength training routine. So we've all heard this. I'm not going to go over this as much, but we have to understand that it's progressive overload. So this means any type of load in any aspect can be a progression, just in different ways. When we see progressive overload, we usually think about volume. We think about measurable overload in the past is tonnage or absolute load. Absolute load is the largest amount of weight an athlete can do for an exercise. So that would mean a 1 RM, a 3 RM test, a 5 RM test, and just purely the fact the weight is on the bar. Then we have tonnage, which is more volume based. So we have load, sets, reps, and being able to understand how to actually see that progression from a week to week standpoint, whereas absolute load is probably more of a formal assessment way to show an athlete is progressing. Now, what are the problems with this? Well, absolute load accumulates a lot of fatigue. So that means as athletes are training and are trying to get absolute load, there are times throughout the year that we don't want them to accumulate a lot of fatigue. That would be in season, coming off a season, coming off an injury. So if we can't use absolute load 100% of the time to show progression, then it's not a good way to actually track progression, because we're going to miss large amounts of tracking just because we don't want them to accumulate a lot of fatigue, which means we're going to not have them do absolute load. So that's going to be needs to change in the future. Absolute load plateaus easily. This means for the first couple of years, as athletes are weak and they start lifting and they become stronger and stronger and stronger, because they're getting stronger, those absolute loads plateaus easily, and then they see frustration, and that's where we start seeing athletes lose buy-in, because we're only using one specific way to show progression for the athlete. It's a singular focus for the athlete. When we think about singular focus for the athlete, this may be good or bad. As some athletes are scatterbrained, where they just think about every single type of things they can do, and other athletes are very singular focused, giving them a specific, hey, I need you to deadlift 400 pounds. That's a goal that they can singly focus on to get there, which is good. But as they get older, they have to be able, or more experienced in their lifting, they have to be able to understand that they're not going to see these 5, 10, 15-pound increases, because they are actually gotten stronger, and it takes time to actually become stronger and show absolute strength increases. We look at a tonnage accounts for one exercise. When we think about tonnage, it only accounts for one specific exercise, not the whole accumulative effect of the athlete and what they're actually doing on a day-to-day basis. Tonnage doesn't account for the time in the exercise. Majority of tonnage doesn't include the tempo, which we'll go over in a minute. Tonnage doesn't account for the cognitive load of the exercise. How much does the athlete have to think about the exercise while they're doing it? Or cognitive load could also be, how skillful is the exercise? Is the exercise more or less skillful? So when we think about pillars of progression, for majority of exercises in the weight room, such as deadlifts, RDLs, the primary lifts, we're going to see stability, volume, and load as the pillars of progression. When we think about stability, we're going to break up stability into three main categories. We have center of mass, points of contact, and constraints. We're going to look at volume. We're going to look at sets, reps, including tempo, so time in that exercise as well. And then we're going to look at load. We're going to look at placement and implement. When we look at stability, we have center of mass. Where is the center of mass of the athlete during this exercise? So when we think about this, this could also be stance. Are they standing on one leg? Are they standing on two? Is it a long gaze lunge or are they lateral lunge? How are they doing this from an upper body standpoint? Are they reaching high, reaching back, reaching forward? Where is their center of mass, and how is that joint throughout the stability? Is it more or less stable based off of center of mass? We have stance, body position, as well through stability. We look at points of contact. How much is touching a stable object? Let me give you an example. If I told you to back squat and I told you to leg press, which one would be more points of contact? Obviously, the leg press. The leg press is a total machine. This is where the cognitive load or skill level of the leg press is going to be so low that it allows the athlete to drive more output. Whereas the squat, it's the same movement pattern, but because it only has 2 points of contact, the 2 feet on the ground, is going to be less stable, which means the athlete has to think more in how to actually organize themselves in space to actually lift the load. So this would be easy, holding a rack, feet and knees on the ground, on a bench for bench press. How much, where are they touching? How much stable surface is being held for this exercise? We have constraint, narrowing down optimal movement of an exercise with either a foam roller, mobility stick, things that we can put into the athlete's exercise that forces them to narrow down specific movement of that exercise without having undesired movement. We can use a wall as well, volume, load, external load, internal load. So we have to look at, when we look at load, the body weight itself. There are some athletes that their body weight is going to be enough to drive some stimulus. Whereas they get older or they're more experienced, external load has to be a primary progression because that's what's going to prepare them for the high velocity, high stress for their sport. We look at sets, rounds of reps, number of times doing the exercise, tempo during each set. So we look at 4 parts. We have the eccentric, isometric, concentric, starting point. Why do we include the starting point? Because there are some times, and we'll look at how to do this from a progression standpoint, that we want the athlete to spend more time in the starting position to allow them to get used to those positions and understand how to actually progress within that exercise without ever having to look at load. When we look at load, we look at load placement. Where is the load stressing the body? Is it anterior, walking, biloaded, contralateral, ipsilateral? How is this going to affect how the body is going to arrange itself from a stance standpoint, from a stability standpoint, to allow them to actually express and adapt the way we want the athlete to adapt? We look at implement. We look at kettlebell, dumbbell, barbell, landmine, any med ball, any type of implement that we could use. Now, when we put this all together, we're going to go through an example. We have the macro progression. So when we look at a macro progression, that's a progression to a new exercise. So if we take a lunge, we have stationary lunge, we have front foot elevated lunge, and then we have rear foot elevated lunge. So a progression from stationary to front foot, that would be a macro progression because we're changing the whole exercise. It's a progression because now with the front foot raised, you're going to get into a deeper range of motion, which is going to challenge the athlete more, which is a progression without ever looking at load. So we're using the macro progression to tell the athlete, hey, you're getting more skillful. Let's take you to the next level of exercise progression and allow you to work your way back up in load to this specific exercise. And then we can progress from a macro standpoint into rear foot, where now there's more weight on that front leg, less stability off the back leg, and then we're progressing the skill macro wise from exercise to exercise to exercise. We then look at micro progressions, a progression within the same exercise. Let's take the front foot elevated split squat or front foot elevated split squat. When we look at a progression within the same exercise, let's say the athlete starts with a med ball. That's an anterior load, whereas, okay, they're getting pretty good. We max out the med balls. Let's say we only have a med ball that goes up to 25 pounds, and they're like, hey, this is too easy. We can then progress to a dumbbell, a contralateral load, and where they're dropping it down and now they're holding it down to the side. This would be a micro progression because it's within the same exercise. It's the exact same exercise, just done with a different implement and different placement of that implement, which challenges the body differently at a harder degrees, which then allows the athlete to still progress without increasing the load. Look at nano progressions. That's your weight, sets, reps, tempo. So when we think about nano progressions, these are the majority of progressions we're going to see the athlete do. Take this example. You may have every single athlete doing the same macro progression, same micro progression, but they could be doing substantially different programs based off of the weight they're doing, the sets they're doing, the reps they're doing, the tempo. If you don't believe me, think about this. If you had two athletes doing barbell RDL, same macro, same micro, but let's say the athlete one is doing 10 reps while the athlete two is only doing 3 reps. Those are going to be drastically different loads, drastically different tempos, different adaptations we're going to see, whereas the athlete 2 with 3 reps is going to drive more output or more force production, whereas athlete 1 is going to be driving more durability, which is maintaining specific positions in a desired state. So even though from the outside, from a macro and a micro progression, these athletes are doing the exact same thing, from a nano progression, they are completely two different programs, and we have to be able to explain that because we're going to get questions from coaches. We're going to get questions from parents asking, hey, why is everyone doing the same program? Well, they're not. Very drastically different programs, but because it's a nano progression, which is usually unnoticeable, everyone thinks you're on the same program. When we think about true progression in the weight room, we have to understand progression in the weight room is unnoticeable. It shouldn't be noticed. But athletes and outside people want that noticeable difference. But in reality, to actually increase and progress in the weight room and have success at what we actually want to have success at, which is getting better at the skill and expressing the skill of the sport, we have to understand as coaches that nano progressions is how we're going to see the athlete actually progress and see progression at all times of the year, tracking where they're at, how are we going to progress, and where they're going in the future, and having a long-term training process to allow them. Nano progressions is the most important progression we can possibly think about and do as a coach. So, in conclusion, progression is more than load. Use pillars of progression to allow better success, and think deeper about athletes' progression year round, week in, week out, training sessions and trading session. Remember, systems drive success, so start building.